My name is Landis Turner. Here in Hohenwald today, May 2, 2000, we're interviewing William C. Keaton, known to his friends and family as Bill Keaton. This is part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. What is your full name?
William Capel Keaton.
Capel, now that sounds French, is it?
It is.
Tell me about the French side. Is that a family name?
That's the family name of my grandmother. Uh, my grandfather on my mother's side of the house. He was French. Now I say it's French. I assume it's French. I think he was, although that I'm sad to say my mother was one of 10 children, and yet I was the only child of those 10. And I didn't do what I should have done and sat down with somebody and gotten the family history on that side of the house. I have a written history on the Keaton side, but nothing on the Capel side. She came from Collierville. Her husband was, I think, French. He was considerably older than she was. He was in his late 20s when she was 14 or 15 when they married.
Weren't there some Capels that you visited or visited you from New Orleans?
Yeah, that was Perry Capel. That was one of my uncles, one of her brothers.
What year were you born?
1913, July 21st, 1913.
And where was that?
Milan, Tennessee, M-I-L-A-N.
That's in Gibson County?
Gibson County, West Tennessee.
Who were your paternal grandparents?
Well, his Debbie J. Keaton was, my parents.
No, your grandparents on your daddy's side.
Okay. My paternal grandparents were Debbie J. Keaton, who was William Jefferson, I believe it was, and my mother was Elizabeth, I think it was Elizabeth, and she was a Craig.
Do you remember your grandfather?
Very well, very well. He lived, my grandfather Keaton lived many years after I was grown.
What kind of work did he do?
He owned and operated a sawmill, a planing mill, and a stave mill.
Did you work there when you were young?
The only work I ever did there was I did work at sawmill a little bit, off bearing at sawmill, for which he paid me the same as he did the others, which was 20 cents an hour for 10-hour day. Was $2 a day. And I did pile staves when I was too young to do that. Paid you so much a pile for piling staves.
Now, your father, I believe you've told me that he died when you were quite young.
I was 5 years old. He died in 1918.
Do you remember him?
I remember him, yes, but I do not remember him. He died in November of 1918, and I remember the event. I remember having flu and pneumonia, and I gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to him. He was 35 years old. He was a banker, and They got a doctor from Memphis, got on a train and came up to see if he could help him, and no good. Didn't do him any good. We all three had it at the same time, flu and pneumonia.
What did your mother do? Did she work outside the home?
My mother had taught school before she married, and of course did not work any while he lived, other than at the home. He had been married previously and lost his wife at a very young age, and they had one son who is my half-brother.
What's his name?
Leroy, L-E-R-O-Y. He's deceased. He's about 7 years older than I am.
And did your mother go back to teaching school?
My mother then went back teaching school, and she taught school in all 46 years. Elementary school.
Elementary. Now, what effect do you think it had on the family for your father to die when you were so young, and they hadn't, and your mother to be a single mom raising a son?
I don't know why. Now, of course, at my age now, I can see things I would have changed. She had gone with a man who was a lawyer in Jackson, Tennessee, by the name of L.L. Fonville, before she went with my father. And he wanted to come and see her after my father died. And of course, I objected bitterly and very selfishly. And if I had to do over, I would change that. But he was quite a well-known lawyer down in Jackson, L.L. Fonville.
How old were you then?
I was 5 years old when he died.
I know, but when Mr. Fonville wanted to
very shortly after,
see him.
I'm sure it wasn't, maybe a year or two, not over a year or two. I must have been 6, 7, maybe 8 years old.
Well, do you think a 6 or 7 year old really would have that much influence? I mean, do you really think you have the responsibility for them not getting back and renewing their friendship?
Well, I don't know, of course. I would have had a lot of influence on my mother, yes.
It occurs to me that if you'd been a teenager, you might have had more than
Yeah.
you would as a 6 or 7 year old.
Yeah, well, you never know.
What were your interests outside working at the sawmill and stave mill when you were in your grade school and high school years?
I delivered groceries. I worked in store on weekends.
What kind of store?
Grocery store. And when I got big enough to work, my brother, after he went to Cumberland University 1 year, I think, and came home, and he worked as a superintendent of construction jobs. I had an uncle by marriage who had a building supply place and also contracted build roads and bridges and so forth. And he was the superintendent for him. And after I got big enough to work, I worked for him.
You went to high school in Milan?
Went to high school in Milan Public School.
And when you got out of high school, had you played any sports? Did you have any sports in your background?
It was all there was to do when I was growing up was play ball. And
Baseball?
Baseball, basketball, football, and we even had a track team 1 year when we got kicked out of the conference for playing an ineligible player or something. And I even ran the half mile in it. So, I started Vanderbilt. Coach McGugan was coach then. And I went up there. I'd never been to Nashville before. I had $10 bill in my pocket. And so I got up there and fall football camp, and I was going to play football at Vanderbilt. And I stayed there through the fall football camp and matriculated. And the first day I went to school, I went to a French class. You had to have foreign language. I'd had 4 years in high school. I really didn't learn much in high school in the way of language. But anyway, I went in, and when I went in, this was a Frenchman who was teaching the class, and he spoke in French. I didn't know a word he said. And so I slipped out the door and went and found me a French class that had an American in it teaching school. Because he was requiring everybody to answer him in French and so forth. And I wasn't that well prepared.
Do you remember what relationship Coach McGugin had to lawyer Dan McGugin and his son George McGugin?
The day I walked in up there, my uncle took me up to Nashville. We didn't have a car, of course. When I got there, Coach McGugin came out, met me, and took me in there, and he turned me over to his son, who was playing football at that time.
Was that Dan?
That was Dan. Dan, and to the boy who was an All-American center that was still going to Vanderbilt games up until a couple of years ago, was when I'd go up there, I'd see him, meet him. He always was there. Why I can't think of his name, I can't think of his name right this moment. I'll think of it. But anyway, he was playing center, and he was an All-American. He took me down to Sigmund U House, which was down on Broad, on corner Broad, and I stayed there and ate at the training table, of course. And then I got worried about my mother's making $40 a month, 7 months in a year teaching elementary school. Parents were making up $25 for the 8th month. And of course, she couldn't help me at all. And we didn't have anything. My father died. Well, we had a big house there that we sold on the edge of town, but that's all. Anyway, didn't have a car or anything. So anyway, I got worried about it, and I dropped out. Went to work for State Highway Department, engineering department.
And what did you do in the highway department?
Well, I was in the highway construction and construction, as well as, I was an inspector over the road work that was done when we were building roads. And I was, we're not building, we did surveys, of course. And I did that for about 10 years.
Well, you must have
while I was going to law school.
You must have learned on the job.
I did, and also, of course, I didn't have any formal education in engineering at all. But anyway, I started out in a engineering party, we called it, and I also worked in the drafting room where we drafted plans for roads while I was in law school there in Nashville.
Okay. Now, how long was it between the time that you left Vanderbilt undergraduate school and went to law school?
Well, that was in 1931, and I didn't go to law school till 1937.
And between those years, you were employed full-time in the highway department?
Yes, I certainly was.
Now, back then, were you required to have any undergraduate degree
None.
or before you went to law school?
None at all. In fact, you didn't have to go to law school to get a license, but you had to pass the bar. In other words, as I remember it, you could. And that's the way I started. My uncle, who was Grover Keaton, who was state treasurer under Gordon Browning, if you remember that period. He did well, I think he is like God to me. You know, he advised me, he and my brother, they just were exception. And he asked me if I ever thought about going to law school, and I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. He said, I want you to go in, and he called the name of somebody. I was in Brownsville at the time on a road job, and I want you to go in there, and I want you to go in there and see if you can't read law in his law office and let him help you. I went in to see him, and he said, well, you know, you've got no business reading law here in my office. You need to go to a night school in Nashville. That is a very fine school, and Grover is going to be state treasurer under Gordon Browning, and said, get him to get you transferred up there, and you go to law school. So I did, and I got transferred up there and I was living on 21st Avenue North, and I walked down Charlotte Pike to 4th Avenue, just below the Capitol there, every morning to save 6 cents car fare. Whether you want to believe that or not, that's true. And I'd always catch a ride home in the afternoon. Somebody's working there for me.
Well, now,
I had a wife and one son at the time I started law school.
Grover Keaton, who served as treasurer under Governor Browning, Governor Browning was governor in the late 30s and then went into service and then was governor again in the 40s. Was it in the 30s?
This was the first time he was served before he went in service. And of course, he was from Carroll County. In fact, he's related to me. You know, it wasn't close relation, but my great grandmother, my first great grandmother, before we remarried, was a Browning, and that's where the Browning connection came in, West Tennessee.
What happened to Grover Keaton after he served as state treasurer?
He was he owned a box company here in Nashville, and he owned a service station here in Nashville. If you remember, on the north side of Church Street, as you go out right after you cross the bridge, right there on the corner was a service station. That was his service station that he owned. And he owned a box company that made paper boxes. And he was in that for a time, and then he went back to Milan in the late years. And he was in the state senate, and he was also in the House of Representatives, and he was state commissioner of elections statewide and so forth. And he never did lose his interest in political affairs.
Other than the lawyer in Brownsville, were you acquainted closely with any other lawyers or associated with any?
None.
Did you have any idea what you were getting into when they talked about becoming a lawyer?
Well, I don't know whether it was my grandfather or grandmother Keaton. One of them said I'd argue with a signpost. That's the only thing I can remember about that.
was the law school like when you went?
When I
was
went,
it hard to get into?
When I went, no, they was glad to get anybody. Back then, it was in the old hotel there, YMCA building. I mean, there on the corner where the hotel is now, on the corner of 7th and Union. And we had a room on the second floor. What I mean, it was a commercial part of the building, and we went there and rode up on the elevator. Did have an elevator, and I spent my weekends in the law library, which was a little room about the size of this room. Dutch boy by the name of Dutch Ullian, who was a lawyer there in Nashville, and I would go in there every Saturday and go, and then we'd go down to the Princess Theater down there on Church Street and see. They had a movie, and I also had traveling groups in there. Had them both.
Live shows.
Live show and a movie. We'd go in there and every Saturday.
How many students did the night law school have back then?
Have no idea. My class had 31 in it that graduated, 31 students.
How long did it take to graduate?
3 years.
Who were some of your classmates?
Tommy Osborne, who represented Hoffa, and
didn't he also argue Baker versus Carr before the United States Supreme Court?
He was a brilliant lawyer. His father was a Baptist minister out at Mount Juliet, I believe, and Tommy coached one of the boys that was in law school there, who didn't graduate, incidentally, but he coached him to get the money to stay in law school. And when he finished, these were rough times. I don't know how much money I was making at that time, but when I married, I was making $72 a month. I remember that very well. And,
do you remember what it cost to go to law school?
No, I don't have any recollection about the cost of it. It wasn't much, very little.
Do you remember whether the faculty back then received any pay, or did they just do this as public service?
They were a fellow by the name Miller Manier, as Manier and Crouch law firm. Miller Manier. The first thing I remember about law school was that after I started school was he came in with a list of lawsuits, and you would read every one of those. Back then, the law didn't change like it is now every 5 minutes. You had a benchmark for every subject you could think of. And Judge Wallace Smith, who was a circuit judge in Hohenwald when I got back from the Army, he had a little box. He would write an opinion in every case that wasn't tried before a jury that you could take and go to the appellate court with. Decide all the cases. He'd sit down with the secretary in that little box, and he knew where everything in there was. I've got a copy of that box, incidentally. And he would give you the book page and so forth.
Who were some of the other classmates you had?
Okay, Tommy Osborne, Bess Blake, who you were with there for a while in the Department of what was it called then?
Public Welfare, and it's now the Department of Children's Services.
All right, she was chief counsel for that after she finished law school, and then she was later commissioner of that department for the state when she died.
Weren't there a couple of judges?
Also, there was, Judge Ramsey Leathers was I believe it was Ramsey, was no, who you say?
I believe it was Raymond.
Was Raymond Leathers. Was Raymond.
That was Ramsey's brother.
Ramsey was clerk of the Supreme Court,
Right.
his brother. Yeah.
What about Dennis Summers?
Dennis Summers was a session judge, I think. He was in that. The man, Ted Welch, his father, that is quite a well-known Republican leader in Davidson County now, is a son of Welch that was in that law class, and he was Commissioner of Revenue at that time in Nashville. And the fellow that was head of the Nashville Electric Service was in that class. The fellow that big law firm in Memphis that Armstrong, the boy that was in it, was a member of that firm. I can't even think of his name now.
What about Ed Herod of the Nashville Bar?
Ed Herod was in it. A number of those people were. Several of them are deceased, like the old boy from Union City that I studied with, who was commissioner of labor while he was in law school for the state of Tennessee. And we had a fine class, just fine class. Two of the top three grades, you've heard me say this before, two of the top three grades on the bar that we took were from my law class.
Were you one of them?
Well, yes, I was third, I think, and there was a half point between the top and the third.
That information is no longer given out.
It wasn't given out then, and I don't know why he sent it to me, but he did. The fellow who was one of the ones in Memphis, I can tell you his name. It's on my law license, but I can't think of it. Unfortunately, my memory's not that well.
Now, when you were in law school, you were already married and had a child?
Yeah, I was married and had a boy, and we lived in a adjoining apartment to another boy who was from Hohenwald by the name of Kistler, who was a year ahead of me in law school. He worked for the Internal Revenue Service and stayed in it after he finished law school.
Now,
Leon Kistler.
Mrs. John Howard Wharf was a Kistler. Was this fellow related to her?
Her brother, her full brother. There were two sets of those Kistler boy children, and he was a full brother of Josephine's.
Now, what was your wife's maiden name?
My wife's maiden name was Stevens, Stephen's.
And what is her full name?
Lillian Woolard, Woolard, which is the family name of her mother, Stevens.
How did you and Lillian meet?
I met her in Erin, Tennessee, when I was with the highway department there. Her sister was married to the engineer who was in charge of that engineering party that I was working for. And I met her there, didn't go with her. In fact, we all went to the creek swimming, and my girlfriend pulled her out. She was about to drown. We were on a double date. But I met her when I was stationed in Columbia with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. They loaned us to that, which was a forerunner of the WPA. And she would come up there to visit her sister and brother-in-law there, and they lived in the same house that I was boarding in. And that's when I got to going with her again, when I started going with her.
What year did you marry?
And we married in in August the 18th, 1933.
Now, she was from Lewis County, but not from Hohenwald, is that right?
No, originally her father ran the store out here at Kimmins, Kimmins, and that's where she was born.
Now, is Kimmins a city today or an incorporated municipality?
No, never has been incorporated. It was larger than the Hohenwald then, but it was, so I'm told. But it was, they had 2 or 3 stores there. That's all it was then.
Hohenwald is one of the few towns left in Middle Tennessee that still has rail service. Did the railroad go through Kimmins?
The railroad went through Kimmins, and as you well know, you had a lot to do with it. When they were going to close this branch that came from Dixon, we got together here and decided to try to get that road, by that railroad, which was done, as you had a lot of big part in.
Did it offer passenger service back when you were first familiar with Lewis County?
When I was first familiar with Lewis County, I don't know, but certainly I never came down here on it. I'm not sure about passenger service in '46, but I don't think it was passenger service then. No, I don't think so.
Now, when you took the bar, did you have a bar review course, or was there such a thing back then?
There wasn't such a thing back then.
So you just prepared on your own?
There was 3 or 4 of us that studied together.
A study group?
A study group. And at that time, George Cloys, who was a boy I was trying to think of from Union City, George Cloys was Commissioner of Labor at that time. George Cloys was one of them, and Bess Blake was another one. And I'm not sure. It seemed like it was one other person, but I cannot think who it was. And we studied for the bar. Back then, the bar group course, the bar questions were totally different from what they are now, as I understand it.
Well, now, I've seen a picture of your class, and there were at least 2 women in it, Bess Blake and Marjorie Rawlins.
Bess Blake, and more than that, wasn't there? There were 5, I believe, 5 women.
That was that not an unusually high percentage? Were there many women lawyers back then?
There weren't, no. There weren't any women lawyers from out there anything tall. I don't know whether there were any then. I guess there were. I just don't know.
But you had 5 in your class?
We had 5 in my class. And they were fine ladies. One of them was married to Jack Norman's brother, who started out in our law class, but dropped out. His wife finished, and she was head of the office up here in Nashville that kept up with the bar business and so forth. And
State Board of Bar Examiners.
I guess that's what it was, yeah. Jean Norman. Her name was Jean, J-E-A-N.
Now, do you remember how long it was between the time you took the exam and when you got the results?
Yeah, you usually got the results in the fall, and I'm not sure what month it was, but it's September, October, something like that.
Did the exam take 2 days or 1?
2 days. I mean, 2 full days.
Were you nervous or under pressure or feeling any stress about it?
Of course, here I put in three years, being away from my family and so forth, going to school, and spent the money, which I didn't have, and I was definitely under stress. I got up there that morning. They gave us the exam up there in the House of Representatives building. The Vanderbilt boys were on one side, and we were on the other side, and we picked that paper up, and they gave you a statement of facts and asked you to write how you would handle this matter. And I knew the answers to the thing. I could not write. My hand, I could not write a word. I got up out of my seat and went to the restroom and smoked a cigarette and came back, and I had no more trouble with it at all. I had every exam on time. You know, you had to do them within a certain time. I guess you still do. And you had to get your stuff in. We had no trouble the next 2 days.
Well, you must have talked to yourself in the restaurant.
Oh, I did. I really gave myself talking to. It wasn't very kind talk either.
Okay, so you passed the bar, were informed that you made the third highest grade, and were things done then like they are today, where you appeared before the Supreme Court and were introduced?
Yes, I was introduced in the Supreme Court building.
Was that a
same place it is now?
Was that a big group that introduced at the same time?
As I remember it, there were, wait a minute, I'm not sure that happened there. I'm blank on that. It may have been at the same place up there. I've been up there for the introductions with others, you know, and I'm not sure whether mine was there or whether mine was...
Maybe in the War Memorial Building.
I have
No, it wouldn't be.
No, I have a recollection about this new building, the Pope building over here. But that was much later, so that wouldn't have been it. So it had to be in the Supreme Court building, where it is now.
But were you introduced as part of a large group, or?
That's the way I remember it.
What, do you remember who introduced you?
No, I don't, but somebody individually introduced me, not somebody introduced the whole group. But I cannot remember that. I just don't remember that.
So after you passed the bar, did you immediately start practice?
No, didn't have the money to start practice. I stayed on, I was living in Gallatin then, working on a project in White House, Tennessee, if you know where that is, and construction job on the road that goes to Louisville. And I stayed on there till I heard about they were going to build this arsenal down at Milan, my hometown, and Oman Construction Company was going to be in it, and I tried to find somebody up here in town, but I couldn't. So then I got down to Milan. I don't know how I got down there. But anyway, I went to Milan and found out who the fellow was that was in charge of the engineering part of it. I went to see him in Humboldt. And he asked me what I'd been doing and everything, and I told him, and he hired me at $90 a week, plus time and a half overtime, all you want to do. Well, that was a gold mine as far as I was concerned. I'd never had any money like that. So I went down there when that project started and built the office building in the wintertime, poured the concrete out there. So anyway, I stayed down there then until I got laid off out there, and when I did, I went in there and went with Mr. J.P. Rhodes, R-H-O-D-E-S. who had a son who was a lawyer in Paris, and then he was up in his 80s at that time, old as I am or older, and he walked back and forth to the office every day and up those long steps. But anyway, I stayed with him a short time, and then the war was getting hot, and I felt like I ought to be a part of it. I don't know why I did, but I did, and I still am glad I did. So I contacted the fellow out there at the project, and that was what called Mile and Orange Depot. There were igloos, all of them underground, covered up with earth, where the ammunition was stored after it was made over at the other place where I had first worked. I was resident engineer on C&D lines, loading lines at the arsenal before I was laid off. And then I contacted a fellow out at MOD, the major, and he hired me to be the administrative assistant to the post engineer at Milan. And I worked out there with Captain Light and a lieutenant who were regular Army for a time, and then I was transferred to Grenada, Mississippi. It was Air Troop Transport Command place where these C-46s pulled the troop transport. They were actually pulled by rope, so to speak, you know. And they would cut them loose when they got to where they wanted to land. They were capable of flying, but had no motor or anything in them. And they would land them then behind the lines and so forth. Anyway, that was quite an experience there. I saw some of them burn up, you know, in flight. My office one, terrible. Anyhow, I was there, and I was drafted from Gallatin. They never did get down that far on drafting people in Gibson County. The major that was post engineer down there, I was a civilian in charge. He said, I'm going across the street and get you a deferment. You're worth more here and you'll be in service. They'll make a truck driver out of you when you go in service or something like that. You've got a law degree, and here you don't need to be going in service. You need to stay here with me. You'll be helpful to me. Well, I couldn't see it, so I went on in service from there.
Well, you were in your 30s, weren't you? Older than
I was 30.
Well, you were older than
31.
most.
Yeah, I had 2 children. I had a wife and 2 children.
Okay, so by then you had a daughter as well as a son.
Yeah.
Now, so you were were older than the average draftee.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, my group, they sent us down to the camp down in Louisiana. I can't think of.
Lejeune?
No, I can't think of the name of it. It was right down there on the coast. And anyway, we stayed there for assignments, you know, where you were going in basic training and specialist training. So I stayed there a while, and I was around the headquarters there, and they sent in one day they gave you an IQ test as a part of your assignment there, and so they sent in a requirement one day for so many men to go to California for that had a certain IQ. It didn't make it any what your background was. So I was in that bunch and got on troop training and went to Camp Cola, California, which was in Sacramento, the capital of California, right out on the edge of it, and that's where I got all my training for the Army.
Now,
then we went overseas from there.
In World War II, am I correct that the Army was the only service that drafted? The Navy and there was no Air Force, but
I can't answer that. I don't remember. I tried to get in the Marines up at Memphis, and it was wrong time or something. They didn't have any that time anything.
why did you want to get in the Marines?
I don't know, 'cause I thought they was tougher, I guess. Anyway, I didn't have much sense then.
They still have that reputation.
Yeah. Anyway, that we went out there, and it was very, very nice. Those people out there were first class.
Where was that?
In California, Sacramento. It was a different world. It was just a different world from Tennessee. Nothing was the same. So I had my basic and specialist training, and then they had me on the list to go to another school out there, and I went in to my commanding officer, and I said, look, I've been through one school, done my 20-mile walk, which you had to do is to wind up in your basic training. And I said, I'm ready to stay with my bunch. We were trained as a group to operate a signal center in the Signal Corps. I was in the Signal Corps for MacArthur in the Philippines. That's what we were trained for. And he said, let me get your file. And he got my file and looked at it. He said, I agree with you. Said, you stay with your bunch. So we went overseas from there. And we're a very close group. We still have a meeting every year. Every year. We'll have one this year over in Branson. It's going to be this year. Last year was in Seattle, Washington.
How many were there in the group during the war? Do you remember?
No, but my group was 92 officers and men.
All right. Now, how many are still able to come to reunions?
Well, I think 10, maybe 15 or less, plus their wives and so forth.
Were you at the Army as an employee when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor?
No, I was not in service. I was working down there. Yeah, I was working at. I'm not sure whether I was working or whether I was practicing law at that time. I practiced law for a very short time down there.
Before the war?
Before I went out to MOD.
Why would
that fellow that I was a law partner with, J.P. Rhodes, was 89 when he quit, and he was a fine gentleman. He practiced law and walked up those steps like a young man until he was 89 years old. And when I went in service left him, well, that's when he quit.
At that age, did you have to check him on things?
At that age, I didn't have the intelligence to check him. The old man, we had an office that is about 8 feet wide that joined up over the bank there in Milan, and it joined an insurance office next door, and we used the insurance agent's secretary. It wasn't big as anything. It had one of those old roll-top desks in there. It took up most of the width of the room, and we didn't have no way could we separate, or one of us have to leave the office while the other was talking to a client. We were just there. They were too.
What was there about your feelings or the times and atmosphere during the war that would cause a 30 or 31-year-old man with a wife and 2 children to want to go into the military?
I think it, well, I think that people who were my age in my group were either in the service or working for something in the service. And I would have to say I had a big thing about that I ought to go. And anyway, I went. I'm glad I did.
So you went to the Philippines.
I went first to Biak. It's an island off the Guinea hen's neck of New Guinea. It's an island right there, and it was a bitterly contested fight that took place there for us to get in there. Those burned out vehicles and everything all over the place there, just horrible. But we were there, and after we left, these Japanese Imperial Marines were big men. You had to be a certain size before you could get in the Imperial Marines. And aside from thinking, as I would now, the Japanese are small people, they were big people. Those were. They just pushed them back in the jungle. And they were still in there. And they were, these little natives who were little bitty short people lived to be, average age span was 35. And they'd give them a Japanese rifle that they'd taken from the Japs, and they'd nearly drag the ground and give them so much a head to bring them in. And some of them they brought in alive, and some of them they brought in weren't alive, you know, so many dollars. And after we left there, they came down on our camp, where our camp had been, and threw hand grenades and stuff and gas over in it. And was in the news media back then, but we were already gone. So anyway, we went to Manila from there. Through, we were in Hollandia, New Guinea also for a while, and then we went through the Halmaheres and Leyte to Luzon, where Manila is in Luzon. And that's where I wound up and stayed till we were discharged.
So you were part of MacArthur's return to the Philippines.
That's right. In other words, to start with, we were there on the Pasig River in a business section and banks. It was just full of banks where that building was, where we were. I stayed there a short time, and they sent me over to another group where I had 35 Filipino civilians and as employees, and I had one or two enlisted men. I was a buck sergeant. I was a corporal when I went over there, and this other group, and then you had to stay within your whatever they allowed for that group, and I never could get. They never did raise it. I was a buck sergeant. Anyway, I had one or two enlisted men and one officer. And we wound up out at Philippine University, living in squad tents of 8. And but we had an office in the old Philippine University.
What were you doing specifically?
We were monitoring teletype and radio traffic to decide when we needed another channel, need to add another group for this, that, and other to communicate, and for security violations. And those Filipino civilians were doing nothing but counting code groups all day long. It was all in code. And of course, we had studied that when we were in our specialist training, with how to do the codes and so forth. But anyway, we weren't having to do any of that there.
Did you ever see General MacArthur?
Yes, some of the boys rode up on the elevator one day with him, but the old boy Stillwell from over there in
China?
well, it's over there near China, but it wasn't China. Anyway, you'd see 2 or 3 of the Jeeps down there with stars on them, you know. They was coming there to see MacArthur. But I never did. I don't recall. I remember seeing him, yeah, but I don't ever remember being close to him. He and his wife and that brat, his son, who was spoiled rotten, lived in the old hotel near where my office was down on the harbor. At that time, I was down there on the harbor at that time. But anyway, he wasn't very well liked by the officers or the enlisted men.
The boy or
The boy.
Oh.
I don't think MacArthur was very highly regarded by the majority of us at that time either.
what about the bombing in Hiroshima? Were you still there when that happened?
Oh yeah, I was there, and I'll never forget the night that we got word that they had surrendered. The Japs had surrendered because I was on duty that night in this old bummed out building right there on the harbor, and everything in that harbor let loose with their guns and stuff. It sounded like an earthquake. And I sat down and wrote my wife a letter that night, and she often wished that she still had that letter. I don't remember what was in it, but I wrote a right lengthy letter that night.
We're going to take a few minutes to break, and when we come back, we'll talk about your legal career and maybe a little politics.
Okay.